Okay, so now we're in part 4 of Technology, Cross-Cultural Ministry, and the Poor, and this section focuses really on case studies of technology in the poor. And I'm going to start off with diffusion of innovation, some of the diffusion of innovation case studies. So um, the case studies that were written in the book Diffusion of Innovation in the chapter that you read um, in the last period actually are some of the best technology case studies of all time. They are kind of, horror stories, honestly, of technology being misapplied, um, and there's lessons to be learned from them. So, one of them was the snowmobiles and the uh, tribe of the Ski-Doo, and the Ski-Doo. They had long-standing um, traditions of hunting, and then whenever the technology of snowmobiles was introduced, all those traditions um, basically were lost in a generation. And then what they noticed is that whenever the technology failed, they're having more and more of the Ski-Doo that were dying because they didn't know how to survive in the cold and they lost those skills. So that's what you would say is a failure, unforeseen consequence of diffusion of innovation. Another case was the oral rehydration therapy, where some people, for good meaning, they went into the developing world and they provided, um, for children who are malnourished, they provided them with formula. And the women stopped nursing, but then the project lost its funding, so you had, I think in this case it was tens of thousands of babies that were actually dying because the mothers could no longer nurse and the project lost its funding. So that's obviously another case study of what not to do. Steel axes for the Aborigines. In that case, it was something completely unforeseen. Some missionaries decided to introduce steel axes to their Aborigines, but again, they didn't anticipate the fact that it was going to completely dislodge their social structures whenever they did that. And doing that, it actually wrecked their whole societal structure because it was created a revolution there. Um, and then the Irish potato famine, where in many cases, the technology actually starts off doing good, where Ireland imported potatoes, and that allowed the Irish population to grow tremendously. But what happened is they had only a few strains of potatoes there in Ireland, and what happened, a new technology emerged where it used to be that diseases couldn't get from North America to Ireland because the trip was too long and the disease would die on the trip, but they introduced faster ships, and all of a sudden these infections from the Americas came to Ireland, and because they only had a few different strains that were susceptible, you had, I think in this case, it was several million people die of famine. And then there's other cases where the people introduce innovations, and even the author himself, who you would think is going to be savvy on this, he for decades would essentially make fun of organic farmers, saying that they were backwards and they didn't have anything to teach the rest of the world. And now people are looking at, they're realizing that organic farmers actually have some sustainable methods that could be used in the rest of the world. And often that's a principle that applies, whenever we work with the poor all the time, is that, people come in with new technologies and they think, oh, we're the only ones, the diffusion of innovation only goes in one direction. It actually always goes in two directions. And that's a part of doing effective ministry. And the organic farmers now are starting to, feed the innovation back into the rest of the world. So, in response to a lot of these failures of technology, in the 1960s there emerged a movement called the Appropriate Technology Movement. This largely, the big the Bible of that was called the Whole Earth Catalog. and it was basically a movement to prioritize technology that's small scale, decentralized, labor intensive, energy efficient, environmentally sound, and locally controlled. It had a lot of strengths to the movement that still exist. In most schools, if you actually go and look, try to look for classes that are technology in the poor, they're going to be called appropriate technology. And I actually considered, calling this course appropriate technology. But after I got looking at it more, I realized that this was a movement largely of hippies, and it was the white Westerners that are leading this movement, which is good. But to a certain extent, I saw many cases where this movement got applied, and it was actually hurting the poor. I think one of the cases that I would argue is the fight against genetically modified crops, and I'm not going to go into the details, but there's at least tens of thousands of Africans that are dying now because Europe won't allow the import of any genetically modified crops to Africa. So you have a lot of a loss of food. So they won't allow their funding to be used for those crops. So there's it isn't always the case, but in a lot of movements, there's always, a strength and weakness. So, the strength of it is it established a dominant culture perspective in academia on using technology to the poor, and it provides many useful features. But the weaknesses really is that, if I had to say what's the fatal flaw of this movement, is often it will prioritize things over people. And I don't believe that is, as Christians, that is either biblical or is people who are called to love. I think that, there are times, like with genetically modified crops and in other cases, where there are trade-offs, and it's important to actually, look at the lives that are being lost. The other reason why I think the appropriate technology movement, especially now, is really kind of the wrong solution for a lot of the needs of the poor, is that scale is needed for many of technologies of the poor. And the appropriate technology movement, by its definition, is overlooking all the technologies that require scale. So digital technologies, mobile phones, and a lot of things that we'll look at. So I think that it has a role, but it's a limited role. And you can see why it emerged out of hippie communes that wanted to live off the grid. But living off the grid isn't necessarily going to be the thing that's most in the best interest of the poor. So there's a lot of other case studies to look at. Christian education globally, there's about 7,200 Bible and theological schools. There's K-12 Christian schools. In the U.S., it's about 70% of students. In many developed countries, or developing countries, that's the largest form of private education. There's a lot of community education programs, after-school programs. Something that I think is going to be interesting to look at is homeschooling. Technology is dramatically enabling homeschooling, and it's been growing at about 75% per decade. It's at 3.4% in the U.S. But I think that I don't think the homeschooling movement is a backwards movement. Some people, say it's for the people who are more backwards. I actually think it's a forwards movement where technology is making it more and more possible for homes to actually compete with school districts. So it'll be interesting to see how that happens globally in the next 50 years. But I would predict that 3.4% is going to emerge to be more like 10, 20, 30% as technology equalizes the playing field. Another case study that I think is really interesting to look at is the one laptop per child. So I'm a graduate from MIT. I'm a big fan of the Media Lab. And what they did is they said we're going to provide one laptop per child in the developing world. It's been criticized a lot for being paternalistic. I think some of the reasons for failure, the biggest one is that it's been eclipsed by things that had more scale. So Android smartphones and tablet markets. I think that they're trying to solve a need that, honestly, there's sometimes the government's the best need, and sometimes it's nonprofits, and sometimes it's private. And Android has done more, to provide computing power to people than anything else. I think the other thing is, you know, the one laptop per child was led by the 1%. It was led by the elite. It was led by, the bleeding innovators that are doing bleeding edge technology. The Media Lab's core competency is in creating sexy tech projects, not in creating change in low-income communities. So what they did is they prioritized technology over more basic needs. So in many cases, and this is what's happening across the world, you'll get you'll get, iPads put in poor districts, or you'll get one laptop per child where a country buys 1 million of them, but the teachers aren't getting paid. So I think that there's problems with those type of approaches. I was a part of a movement called the Community Learning Centers, Community Technology Centers movement. And I can speak a lot to the case study of that. So I was the founder of the Association of Christian Community Computer Centers. I ran a computer center that was trying to address the digital divide in Boston, served a few thousand people. And there's a movement called the Community Technology Centers movement. Now, there's a lot of lessons from that. I think, one of the big lessons that I'll talk about later is these were the early adopters. How do you do community technology? How do you help the poor with technology? But what they didn't do is they didn't recognize that, as the technology shifts, it's going to be mainstream. So there's two parts of the problem for community technology centers. One was the access problem, and the other was the training problem. So, a lot of people, and part of what happened right around 2005, people decided that the digital divide was solved because, more and more people started getting computers in their homes, at least in the U.S., and all the funding went away. So the access problem essentially got mainstreamed by moving to libraries and homes. But then the training problem moved to adult education and youth programs and higher education. So that's part of the reason why Tech Mission, we started in AC4, but we actually adapted, and really there was almost none of our peers that adapted through that. So I think that, the lessons there, and, one of the lessons that I said is, we're trying to solve a problem that, the government can try to fight to address the digital divide, the nonprofit sector. And I actually thought the government and nonprofit sector were going to play the biggest role. But looking back on it, the Android operating system has done more to address the digital divide than all governments, all nonprofits in the world combined, I would say. So a private sector solution actually ended up winning. That isn't always the case. Many times the private sector is a failure. But the big lesson was around crossing the chasm. So, some of the best practices we learned in a computer center, for those of you who are looking at, running a computer center, is, it has to be mainstream. So what that means is you're going to have to operate as a part of an adult program or a youth program in a well-funded Christian social service organization, or if it's a non-Christian organization, in those. Some of the other practices, the cost of running the computer center, it was the maintenance cost of the machines that was the biggest cost. So, look at strategies for low-cost virtualized machines. A lot of groups have looked at, ways to just provide thin clients through, laptops, or, the Google Chromebook has actually been really successful. Using OpenDNS or router-based filtering for client machines can be really helpful. Consider using, cloud-based Google Apps or Office 365, and trying to provide structured educational time using online educational tools. So what we found is if you're running a program, it needs to be a program. If you just provide people with access to the internet, then that's not going to teach them a whole lot. They're going to keep doing the same thing. If they like watching TV, they're going to watch TV online. It takes a program, and it takes structure to actually bring the shift. So some of the other projects that I learned from was the Universal Christian Wikis. So there's a lot of groups that are out there. I talked with, and this also I would say goes with the Christian social networks. We started this, we did urbanministry.org. We got about 150,000 articles. There's another group called Strategic Network. They got probably 50,000 articles around missions. We got 150,000 articles and materials on serving the poor. the fundamental problem was we were assuming that 1% of our visitors would contribute. And that would have made it, viral. I mean, that's the magic word that everyone looks for. But it actually ended up being 0.001% contribute. So that was one problem. The other was that the value of other networks superseded the value of having an independent network. So Wikipedia, it was better to just keep this information in Wikipedia or YouTube than to have an independent network. So the theory that it was based on, that there would be some value in having a separate Christian network, ultimately ended up, not being true. So the conclusion was the scale for Christian social networks and wikis is too high to compete. For Christian organizations, wikis are just another type of content management system, unless you have a captured or a semi-closed audience. So, if you're running an association, or if you're running a conference, or you have, a closed audience that's going to use your content, then a wiki might be useful, or even a social network might be useful. That's how Facebook got started. It had one campus. So if you have a closed network, or a church, sometimes that can be useful. But if you're trying to do something that's universal, I think that it's likely to fail. So one of the big lessons out of all of this comes from this idea of crossing the chasm. And this is probably the most universal principle that I've seen. And what happens is a new technology comes out, people see the huge potential it has for the poor and to change society, but the people who see it first are often in this category of the innovators or early adopters. Now what this is the innovation curve. Most of you have seen this before. It breaks up the people who adopt technology into 5 categories: the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards or skeptics. And there's 2 key principles in this chart. One is Amara's law, which is that we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. And the other principle is the chasm, that the organizational culture to meet the needs of early adopters is entirely different from the culture to meet the needs of later adopters. Now, why is this important with the poor? So if there's any one lesson you're going to get from this period, focus on this lesson. It's because the poor usually are going to be in the early or late majority, or maybe even in the laggards. But especially the early majority and late majority, a lot of the poor are eager to use technology in the early majority, but they just can't afford it. So it's a lot harder for them to be in the early adopters or the innovators. But the problem is that the early adopters and innovators are usually the ones that are trying to solve the problem. So the case in point was the Media Lab at MIT doing the 1 laptop per child. That wasn't the solution. 1 laptop per child now is kind of humorous, that you're going to provide 1 laptop to 7 billion people on the planet. Whenever you're looking at now, the idea that 7 billion people on the planet would have a smartphone actually seems pretty likely. So you had that 1 laptop per child vision, which largely was hype, being replaced with the smartphone vision, which is actually gonna fulfill that. So again and again, this idea has happened. So with the community computer centers, you had the idea community computer centers really were before the chasm. The group that's gonna reach the poor, and I'm hoping that City Vision will be a part of that, will be the mainstream group. So it's going to be these rescue missions, it's going to be Salvation Armies, it's going to be churches, it's going to be larger institutions, and they're going to bring in mainstream technology to people. So the question is, how do you bring that in? I'm going to talk a little bit later about some fantastic examples of this. So you look at radio and you look at television, and you look at audio, the audio gospel and the video gospel, and you look at some of the most successful attempts. The number one most successful technology in the last 50 years, technology attempt for Christians has been the Jesus film. And video was available for decades whenever the Jesus film came out. It'd been available for 70 years. They had movies. So these were not the early adopters. Television and even color television was available for decades. But what they did is they recognized what is the culture you need to do to reach the early majority and the late majority. Well, one, you need to have it in the right language. So, that's where they focused, is they focused the video. They didn't do anything super high tech. They just did one video, um, and they just dubbed it to thousands of languages, and that's what made it successful. They claim that there's been, I think they said, over 100 million decisions to follow Jesus. Even if that isn't true, and it's a fraction of that, that still is amazingly successful. So why do these things fail? Here's the conclusion I've come to. One of the main reasons why they fail, in addition to people not recognizing the principles of how do you serve the early majority and late majority, the groups that come in to serve the early majority and late majority, often they come in with massive scale. So Google wasn't the first search engine, but they came in and they had massive scale. They had the most servers out of anyone. They had the best results, and they made it dead simple. You just have the search box and that's it. Skype wasn't the first voice over IP company, but they came in and they made it dead simple. Same thing with Apple. They didn't have the first smartphone. So, but what they did is they were able to do it right and then scale it. So the biggest problem I see is that it's people who are trying to solve $1 billion problem with $10,000. They want to create the next the Christian Facebook, and they have $10,000 to do it, and it's just not going to happen. Even Facebook. So they're able to create a small social network among a few campuses because it was a limited space, but they had to get $100 million of investment before they could actually scale it to become what it was. So, and looking at how all the different things scale, how's your revenue model work? Does that scale as it grows? How do your in-kind resources scale? So Wikipedia, is able to get the in-kind resources so it can scale. How does your social value scale? How does your earned income scale? Part of TechMission strategy changes recently has been to say that all these things have to be in line. We have to have social value scale with earned income, scale with expenses. You can't just have them scale disproportionately, or you end up having expenses that spiral out of control, and then that's not sustainable. So here's just I used to consult to venture capitalists, and part of my job was assessing do these people have what it takes to do this thing. And this is just off the top of my head, but if I had to say, if you're going to create a Christian social network, you probably shouldn't even try to do it unless you have $100 million. Now, why is there no Christian social network? Maybe it's a bad idea. I think the bigger reason is it's a $100 million investment that's probably less than 50% likely to succeed, and no one wants to make that type of investment. There's this idea I've talked about, the Christian social graph. How do you map all the Christian objects? Have a map of every church, every parachurch, every volunteer opportunity. We've been trying to do the volunteer directory, and honestly, we ran out of resources. We got about $2 million into it. It's about a $10 million project. We got some of it down, but I think other people will have to lay some of the additional part of it. Christian Wikipedia, I just don't think that's going to happen. Christian YouTube, there's GodTube, but I think it got acquired by a different group, and I think it's a $10 to $50 million project. There's a group called Q that's trying to do Christian TED Talks. Will they be able to scale? Well, I think they got some seed funding now, but unless they get to the $10 to $50 million range, I think it's going to be hard to see whether they can scale. So the question is, how do you build a $100 million project whenever you only have a few million dollars? That should say $100 million project. Well, sometimes you just don't do it, and sometimes you figure out ways to piece it out, like Facebook did. You get a smaller portion of it that you can do that is helping people. So the other principle that I've learned is this idea of the law of network effects. So there's a lot of things that follow network effects. So and I'm going to just kind of talk through this equation here. So you have quality, then you have uniqueness of your network, but then you have the scale of your network squared. So your uniqueness better be really high. So there's some areas where, like a Christian dating site, that's actually pretty unique. I might put the uniqueness value at 1 million or something like that. And then the scale of the network. So, how big do you have to be? ChristianMingle.com. Well, you probably have to have 50, 100,000 people for it to compete with the other groups that, are going to be good quality. The quality is, generally the Christian quality is going to be less than the other quality, so you're going to lose there, but it's the uniqueness factor. So if you're going to, compete with a lot of the other, dating sites, then it's going to have to be really unique. So, we tried this Universal Christian Wiki. It wasn't unique enough compared to the wiki. So the law of network effects, because Wikipedia has 1 billion users, so 1 billion squared is going to be a lot bigger than our website. It had 1 million. So that's the reason why our value was more linear, where theirs was more exponential. Some of the other opportunities that are coming out, and I feel like, so, having applied some of those lessons, what I want to do is I want to talk about, okay, having applied those lessons, what are the current opportunities out there? Open education, I think, is the logical successor to the digital divide. So there's many educational resources that are being commoditized and made free. Part of what I talk about in my dissertation is that there could be an app store with tens of thousands of accredited courses, or learning available at no cost. Christian schools can build an open, low-cost educational resources to bring education to the poor. And it has the potential where Christians, just like has happened with homeschooling, Christians might start to become a much bigger percentage of the pie in terms of education. It also could go the other way. But this is, I'm summarizing what, City Vision's mission is. We're going after this thing, open education. Another opportunity, and these are all, most of these case studies are listed, and I have links where you can read more about these. I've already talked about the audio-video gospel. So the problem is that 2/3 of the world is oral communicators. So 50% of the world is illiterate. So you can have the Bible in every language, but even if you have the Bible in every single language in the entire world, then you could still only reach 50% of the world, because you need to provide the gospel orally for the people who can't read. So the Jesus film, it's had 200 million indicated decisions for Christ, and it's been watched by billions of people, the most watched movie of all time. Faith Comes by Hearing has translated the audio Bible into over 500 languages. It's available, I think, to over 1 billion smartphones. It's not on all of those now, but they also provide boxes that only cost like $20, and it can, be solar powered and can speak the Bible in 500 different languages. So, the lesson out of these is technology is useful if you start with the needs of the people you're trying to reach. So, a lot of people in the developing world, they need things in oral language, and they need it in their own language. So you start with those two principles, and then you work backwards, and then you have to scale it. Both Jesus Film and Faith Comes by Hearing are pretty scaled up projects. They're $10 to $100 million projects, and it's because the reality is you don't need 50 Jesus films translating it to 500 languages. You just need 1 or 2 Jesus films translating it into the language. I think it's like actually several thousand languages that they're doing. Same thing with Faith Comes by Hearing. So you don't need that many. Other emerging opportunities that are out there that I have case studies on. So clean water. Again, there's been a need for clean water for million or for thousands of years, and but there's people are mainstreaming it by finding ways to sell it socially through social networks, and then for $10,000 you can build a new well, and then that's going to provide water to a village for 20 years. That's a lot easier to sell on social networks. Ultra low cost higher education, that's what we're trying to do with City Vision. Mobile banking in developing countries is going to radically transform the world where, right now there's less than a billion people who have access to banking. Pretty soon there's going to be 3 to 5 billion that have access to banking. And it's largely going to be through mobile. Solar in developing countries is also going to be hugely transformative. If you don't have power, you can't access a lot of these technologies. So that's one big part of it. The other part is I was recently in Jamaica, and Jamaica they bring tons of money into their country through tourism, and they said that they spend even more on fuel because they have to import all their fuel. In 20 years, the cost of solar is going down like it's basically following Moore's law. So you look at what happened over the past 30 years on the cost of computers, and now in an iPhone you have more technology than was available to all of NASA whenever they put a man on the moon. That's going to be happening in solar. You'll have in 30 years the cost of solar is going to be dramatically lower, or if trends continue, it's going to be dramatically lower than all other forms of energy, and that's going to completely change the trade balance for a lot of the developing world, because one of the nice things about the developing world is, especially in a lot of parts of the developing world, the one thing that's abundant is sunlight. So if you're able to have solar energy that is at 1/1000th of the cost that it currently is, then that's going to really dramatically change the world. So another thing is mobile health. You're seeing devices again that are at 1/1000th of the cost, and you can just connect it to a mobile phone, replacing a device that was hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. So these are some of the emerging tech opportunities. So some of the other key principles, just to summarize again, most people underestimate the scale to effectively serve the poor. That's the reason why, I think that the appropriate technology movement has some good things, but the fact that they don't like scale, I think, is actually hurting the poor. The other is this cultural mismatch. The poor are often reached in the second half of crossing the chasm, but the techies are often led by innovators and early adopters. I don't know how many techies I've seen trying to bring Linux into Africa, and I think there's a big place for Linux in Africa for servers, but for clients, I think it's the prototypical missionary who I'm the innovator. I'm in the 1% that's the earliest adopter, and I'm going to try to force that understanding on you. Whereas the reality is, if you're wanting to serve the poor with technology, most of it's happening on mobile. So that's nothing to say anything against Linux, and in many cases these mobile phones are a variant of Unix, but it's just that they're changing their form so that it's more mainstream acceptable. So the last thing I want to just cover is the final project. So just to give a quick summary, the literature review, I don't want you to spend too much time. It's going to be less than 10% of your grade. Spend most of your time on the final project. So the idea is you need to get a project that is a real-world example of what we're doing in this course. So you can either do it for your current job, or you can imagine a job that you would do it for. And the imagine is, imagine your boss gave you an assignment to, learn how are you going to use technology, cross-cultural ministry, and the poor in a given context. So I've given some examples. I think a lot of you have good projects. If you don't have a project by now and you're watching this, you better get a project quick, and you better talk with a lot of people about it, because the idea is that you need to be doing projects where there's other examples of people to learn from. You aren't going to invent the unicorn in this space. If you think you found something no one else has ever done, most likely you think you found a unicorn, and it's probably something that's not going to fly. So focus on something where you can learn from other people. The last part of the project is just self-reflection. It's going to be 5% or maybe even less of your grade. So anytime you have a final project, and I think in this course, of your total course grade, I think over 70% of your grade is in this final project. So put a lot of work into the final project. If you have questions, interact with me on it, but don't turn in a final project that isn't quality. I expect something 20 to 25 pages. A lot of that can be the research that you found, or whatever plan. And a key point, and this is one thing I want to emphasize. A master's program is about applying. It's about creating. So, for some of you, this is your first time. You're used to undergraduate courses, which are about regurgitating knowledge. That's not what this project is about. You should be creating. You should be applying. So, a big part of what I'm going to be grading this on, if you look at my rubric, is, you know, is there really a practical application? Are you making something that would be successful in the world, or are you, just making something up that is, not likely to be successful? So it's the practical element of it, that there would be a practical application, that you're taking these principles, you're translating them into your context, and you're giving a practical application. So hopefully that's helpful. If you have any questions, just send me an email or contact me. Thanks.